Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video it is something very special because I'll be talking about another compact camera. It's the Powershot G11, and yes, this camera came out quite a long time ago, around the year 2009, and to be honest, it is still a very nice and fun camera to use, and if you actually use it properly, you can actually get some very nice use out of this camera, and also it will actually deliver really nice results as well, and you can actually do some really nice fine prints with this camera, well, the results out of this camera as well. So yeah, in this video I'll be sharing with you my thoughts on this camera. It's not a full in-depth review video, it's just a video based on my thoughts, based on my experience that I used with this camera for the past year or so. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the G11, despite being out in 2009, it is still a very capable and a very nice, reliable compact camera to use nowadays, assuming that the quality of the images is not your top priority. It is still good, but just nowhere close to being, you know, a more modern day standards camera, or even like the standards from 5 years ago. But, you know, if you know what you're doing, you still can get really good images out of this camera. And of course, on paper, it looks like a downgrade from the original G10, simply because, you know, this camera feels a little bit more clumsy. I'm not sure how you say it, but in the same time, the resolution has also been dropped from 14.7 megapixels down to 10 megapixels. That being said, there are other kind of areas where this camera actually improves upon the G10, and I'll be discussing in this video later on in the video, of course. And in this video, just like in any of my other thought videos on different cameras, I will actually be dividing into 3 different sections. The first one is the usability and the ergonomics, and then followed by the actual image quality for both photography and video, and then followed by the conclusion. So let's first start with the ergonomics and the usability of this camera. Well, this camera actually feels very nice in hands, despite what I said about it earlier between the G10 and this camera, because the G10 actually still feels very good. I do like the finishing on the G11 much more, but because I think the flaw of the design on the screen right here, that there's no lock, and also it protrudes out a bit too much, that you kind of feel insecure when holding it like this, because you actually feel like you could actually press on the buttons right here if you actually hold it too hard, but in the same time the screen really protrudes too much into this area right here, which is a little bit cumbersome after a while of using it. And the G12 actually improves it a lot, because the screen feels a bit more flushed in. It's not completely flushed in, but in the same time it's a nicer finish. It has a much more matte and grippy kind of finishing to it as well. They also added a little bit of grip here as well, and the screen just doesn't protrude in as much to the control panel of this particular design. Whereas the 11, it's kind of like a funny in-between design, where it's like they almost finalize it and then they finalize it with the G12. So it's just a little bit of a funny design to me. But otherwise, it is a very nice and usable camera, and the one that you still in general feel very nice and solid in your hands. And if you just move onto the side here, you also have very nice ports that if you use your HDMI a lot, and also if you use your remote port a lot, and if you're a type of person who connects the camera to the computer and download the images a lot, there's also the USB port. I really love how the HDMI on this camera, well, the HDMI port on this camera is not a micro HDMI port, because that one is so unreliable and can break easily. So that's nice if you're into actually using HDMI cable connecting to this camera. But you also have the remote option if you wanted to do intervalometer, even though this camera, you know, it doesn't have a dedicated time-lapse feature built in, but you still can actually use the remote, just like with pretty much most of the other Powershot G series cameras. You still can connect your remote to here and do intervalometer with, so that's actually pretty nice. Or if you just want to do long exposure photography without setting the timer, you can still connect your remote, and that way you know that you're accessing or pressing the button elsewhere without, you know, pressing physically on the actual camera body itself, just to avoid that extra vibration into the camera or shakiness into the camera. So that's actually pretty good. Moving on to the front of the camera, just like most other Powershot cameras as well in the G series line, you can actually press this lever right here and take this ring out, so you can actually mount different accessories onto this, whether it's the special lens hood, special lens protection, telephoto lens, wide angle lens, things like that. And yeah, it's just overall a very nice design to have. And also moving on to the back of the camera, back to the back for a little bit. The screen here, despite not having a lock, but it is still a very nice and responsive screen, so the refresh rate is also pretty good. If you're working in normal lighting condition, you will be able to actually judge your exposure, your composition, your colors and everything really accurately as well. The contrast on the screen is also quite good, apart from if you are trying to, using it in kind of like an extreme angle, then that is when the contrast level kind of decrease a little bit. And also if you're working in direct sunlight or with a strong light source behind you, you might have to kind of like shield your screen a little bit just to judge your exposure, your compensation level, your composition, your colors and everything better. But also if you can't see the screen, or for some reason you don't want to use the screen, you still can use the optical viewfinder right here. It will actually zoom as your lens zoom with you, and because it is not directly connected to the lens, it's only seeing what this particular viewfinder is seeing. It's not precisely 100% on what you're going to get, so just keep that in mind. But it will give you a very nice, very close approximate of what you're going to get in terms of your focal length. So that's actually very nice, and it's also very neat that it actually zooms in with you. So yeah, and there's the diopter, which is really convenient. If you have your eyesight, you can actually adjust it to your sharpness of your eyesight. So yeah. That's pretty good. But otherwise, the buttons and every dials or the feelings, it has a very nice tactile feel to it. Just like the G10, everything feels very deliberate, in the same time very neatly designed. So you're not going to be accidentally pressing or turning on any of these dials up here, for example, but you might be accidentally pressing on the back wheel here as well, and also accidentally rotating the wheel back here as well. So yeah, just keep that in mind because of how much it really protrudes out due to the screen right here. That's a bummer, but that is what it is. If you can get used to it, you can just get used to it, and it will not really be bothering you that much. But otherwise, it can be a problem in the beginning, which was kind of a problem for me in the beginning, but not really anymore because I got used to it in the past year. So yeah, moving back to the front for a little bit, this camera does have an AF assist beam, just like many of the other compact Powershot G series cameras, and it's actually quite nice. It's not too harsh and it's not too soft. It actually aids the autofocusing points quite well. And talking about the autofocusing system on this camera is actually quite accurate enough. Of course, it's not the fastest in the world, but it is a tiny bit faster than the G10. Just it is still kind of like, yeah, it gets the job done. It's not like lightning fast, but it's not slow that you're going to be waiting a long time. It's just focus, less than a second, and then you can just take the shot. So yeah, that's pretty good. And also, in low lighting situations, the focus can be a little bit slower, of course, but in completely dimly lit environment, the autofocusing system can actually not be as reliable, and also just doesn't work a lot of times in general, just doesn't want to focus in general in super dimly lit conditions, so just be aware of that. But in super high contrast situations, the autofocusing system will still be able to try to find the right focus area and also just really nicely, accurately focus on that particular focusing area as well. So that's actually quite good as well. The metering system on this camera is also quite nice. You can actually trust the metering system on this camera for the most part. Just that, during the twilight hour or the golden hour, it might actually messes up the auto white balance, but also the metering system on this camera a little bit. So just be careful. But that's why you have the full manual control option as well, should you want to do full manual control, which is something I usually do anyway. So yeah, that's pretty good. Up here you have the hot shoe, which you can actually mount all of the flashes you can think of on this camera. Well, that actually uses the hot shoe. So yeah, there is that. So that's actually quite nice and neat. So despite being such a small package and a small camera, you still can actually have full manual control and add other accessories that would also be able to be mounted onto the hot shoe itself. You cannot mount a microphone that would actually, being recorded onto the main board or into the internal preamp, but you can actually mount some sort of microphone up here, like an external recorder, and then sync the audio up should you wish to do that later in post, but you have that option as well. And of course, if you're shooting video, you can also mount an external light up here as well if you want to shoot video with this camera, despite the resolution. But I'll talk more about that later in the video section, of course. This camera also has a very nice battery life. So if you move down to the bottom of the camera here, the battery is housed in this compartment, and it's a very nice Canon NB7L battery, which is the same one you'd find also on the G12, G11, which is what I have in my hand, G10, and quite a few other Canon Powershot cameras as well. So looking for a brand new third-party brand new batteries for this particular camera is actually very easy, and it's also very affordable. And yeah, so if you're looking to getting this camera, the batteries are still available out there brand new in the online market as well. But what I really don't like about this battery compartment, which is something I complain a lot about all of the other, well, pretty much most of the other Powershot G series line of cameras, is that it's not in the center where, well, the tripod mount is not in the center where the sensor is. So if it was in the center where the sensor is, that would actually help a lot when it comes to, you know, doing a panorama shot, especially when you're doing it manually onto the tripod, because it actually helps a lot with the parallax and everything. But on the other hand, it would also help with, you know, freeing up some space over here next to the battery compartment and the SD card compartment, simply because it is right next to it. So if you have a tripod mounted here, and if you want to change your battery, it will still be stuck. And likewise for the SD card. So if you're doing a lot of long exposure photography, and if you need to change your battery, you have to unmount it from the tripod or the tripod plate, and then just, you know, access your battery, which can be quite cumbersome and troublesome as well. So it's also a little bit of a waste of time and an inconvenience for that matter. So yeah, there is that. But, you know, on the other aspect, this camera has a very nice versatile lens to it. It has the 28 to 140 millimeter lens, and the aperture is quite nice. It starts at f2.8 and then it works all the way down to the f4.5. I wish that would actually be more of like the G16 with the f1.8 to f2.8, but you know, this will actually get its job done. And talking about the lens, it is sharp enough. There is some chromatic aberration to it, but very minor. And even though it's not the sharpest lens in the world, but for the resolution of this camera, it's definitely sharp enough. And there's a very nice contrast to the lens as well. So that's actually quite good. Still staying in the front of the camera, it has a built-in flash right here. I wish it would actually be more of like a G16 or a G1X kind of design, where it actually pops up like this, because it actually is a bit further away from the camera. Therefore, you can actually reduce the chance of having that red eye effect when using flash to photograph your portraits, especially at night. But you know, it is what it is. It's nice and big over here. It is also reliable, so it's a good flash in general. But if you're not shooting a lot of portraits, so you don't really need to actually worry about too much when using flash, or if you're using flash at all. Whew. Now moving on to the next point, which is more software and the operational side of things related. This camera is able to shoot a whopping 1.1 frames per second compared to the 0.7 frames per second of the G10. Now, of course, I said I wish that the G10 would shoot a little bit faster, and this does shoot a little bit faster at 1.1 frames per second, but I really just wish it would shoot, let's say, at 3.5 or at least at 2 frames per second. That would actually help out a lot. But of course, assuming it shoots at 2 frames per second, I'm also not sure if the autofocusing system would be able to really keep up with that speed, because it is really that slow, but it's again not really so slow, but it's just slow enough that it's not going to be able to push 2 frames per second if it were able to actually do 2 frames per second. Now moving on to the next point, despite the fact that this camera doesn't have a weather sealing, but the camera construction quality wise is actually quite nice. It doesn't feel as solid as the G10, and it doesn't feel as robust as the G12. I guess it's also because of the finishing. It does feel a little bit hollow inside for some reason, but it is overall still a very nice camera to hold in hand. It's very comfortable. It actually kind of trigger a little bit of confidence out of this camera as well, because it does look, you know, more serious than a traditional compact camera would, but it is still a camera that allows you to really grip it quite nicely and also give you that manual control. It does allow you to actually access all the controls quite nicely at your fingertips from the layout of the buttons and everything, but the actual software itself is also very nicely designed. So whether it's the quick menu in the live view screen or the actual full menu page itself, everything is very nicely and efficiently organized and categorized and pretty much put together, so that You can access a lot of features quite nicely, quite fast and quite efficient as well. So that's something that I really love about the Canon menu system. You know, from different generations already, they've always been known to actually have very nice and organized and efficient menu system, and this is no exception to that, so that's actually pretty good. And also having such a nice and user-friendly menu system, whether both quick menu or full menu page inside this camera, well, it really allows you to also have a very fast workflow and also efficient workflow as well. So let's say if you're actually going out to photograph some stories, some moments, just to capture here and there, snippets here and there, it's more like if you just want to access certain features, you can just do it seamlessly and effortlessly, that it feels like the camera is actually part of you and you just really focus on the actual scene itself, rather than with some other brands where, you know, you spend a lot of time into the menu system looking for certain things like the ISO limiter, things like that, and then you just become more frustrated with the time you spend on, you know, looking for certain things in those menus, that you just feel very distracted from your environment already, whereas this camera makes you feel like you're part of the environment, so that's actually very nice as well. So yeah, that's it for the ergonomics and the operational side of things. It is very nice, it is very responsive, the autofocusing system is good, but now let me talk a bit more into the image quality. The image quality out of this camera is actually quite nice. I love the color science out of it. It's very nice, kind of old vintage kind of digital look, albeit a digital compact camera look as well, which is very different from, you know, if you're working with the older mirrorless cameras or the older DSLRs from Canon, because those has a very different look due to the nature of the sensor size, but also the nature of the pre-programmed color science in those cameras. So if you're really into like the old digital look of compact cameras, I would still recommend this camera, simply because it still has that very nice Canon old digital look to it. The skin tone renditions is actually pretty good on this camera. The rendition between different color tones are also pretty good, and also the color reproduction, the color depth is also pretty good out of this camera. If you want to do some A4 prints or A3 or A2 prints, even the very fine prints, you still can do that with this camera, which is actually pretty good, especially if you shoot in RAW and do some, you know, minor adjustments, just bring the image up to life a little bit. You can really produce some really nice, great results out of this camera. The downside with the sensor of this camera though is, yes, it's a downgrade in terms of resolution coming from the 14.7 megapixels of the G10, but in the same time it is still a lot of resolution to play with. So if you're just posting on your social media, you know, it's less than 2 megapixels, so you can actually still crop in a little bit into the image and do some manipulation, do some editing, do some post-processing with the images, and it would still look fine on social media. Or if you're taking pictures in low lighting situations where there are a lot of noise, you can still trade in some of the resolution just to smoothen out the image a little bit, denoise the image a little bit. And yeah, and talking about noise, this camera allows you to shoot between ISO 80 to around 3200, and actually you can just look up here, yeah, 80 to 3200, which is actually quite nice. But I personally wouldn't go above ISO 800, because above 800 ISO you will start seeing a lot of noise creeping in, and that's where you don't really want to, you know, fuzz around with the denoising feature. But it does allow you to actually shoot at ISO 80, so on, you know, a bright day like today, or on a gloomy day like today as well, but just really bright outside still, you can actually bring it down to ISO 80 and the images will still be very, very clean. So yeah, there is that, and it's also a pretty good feature. And on top of that, this camera actually allows you to shoot with the built-in ND filter as well. So it's such a versatile camera that has a built-in ND filter into this camera. So if you want to do some sort of like slow down in terms of the shutter speed a little bit on the bright daylight, you do have the option to have the built-in ND filter to kick in, so that's actually pretty good. And now over onto the video quality side, well, what I said about the photography side of things can actually bring over to the video side of things as well, in most parts. So the color science is still there, the color reproduction is still there. The downside is that the dynamic range is not so good. The resolution is only at 640 by 480p, and yes, it's not a lot, but you know, if you just want to have some sort of like vintage digital look video file, then, you know, this camera is the camera to, you know, really go for, and it does have that softness to it as well, so that's pretty good. It's not jittery, which is actually quite nice, but yeah, the dynamic range is a little bit on the low side of things. So yeah, oh, and what I forgot to mention in the photography side of things is don't expect the dynamic range to be, you know, as good as, let's say, the more modern iPhones out there, because even the more modern iPhones out there will have much better dynamic range because of the computational photography that it has, whereas this camera doesn't. But this camera does have a very natural roll off into both highlights and shadows, so that's actually pretty good as well. And now back into the video quality, back onto the dynamic range, because the video quality, the video file you get out of this camera is very compressed, the dynamic range becomes even more limited. And but what I mean by limited is that you do see a clear difference between the dynamic range in video here and also in the photo files. And you'll see that even more pronounced when you're doing post-processing because of the baked, super compressed video file out here. You cannot really recover as much shadows or highlights in total. So yeah, that's something to watch out if you do shoot video with this camera. Just watch out for the exposure, watch out for the dynamic range, watch out for the contrast and everything you're actually taking videos of. But if, you know, you're not really caring too much about that, then yeah, it's a very nice video to experiment with if you don't mind the resolution that is, and also the softness. The zoom range is also quite nice in video, and also the image stabilization, or the IS, also works really well with this lens and also with this sensor. So what I really love about this camera is that the IS for both photography and video, it works very well. And for photography, you can actually handhold it in like a semi-low shutter speed as well and still get sharp results. Same with the video mode, is that if you zoom in, you still can get a fairly stable image as well out of this camera without, you know, too much stabilization effort going into your hand, because the IS is very powerful. So yeah, there is that. Then there's obviously the Moire and Aliasing. I don't think I mentioned about the Moire and Aliasing in photography mode, so let me actually just go back there a little bit. The Moire and Aliasing in photography mode is present. It is there, but also it has been improved over the G10 quite a bit. And if you watch out for fine details, fine patterns, and try to avoid super complex fine details and patterns, you will be able to, you know, come out with clean image without a lot of moire and aliasing. If you're photographing a lot of houses with really fine pattern of bricks, you will still get away with it because it is, well, in most cases you will be able to get away with it because it is really nicely controlled. But if you're photographing really fine patterns and super complex patterns and details on the fabrics itself, you will still get minor moire and aliasing with this camera, so watch out for that. And in terms of video mode, what that translates into is, because the file's already much more compressed, much more baked in, the moire and aliasing is much more pronounced out of the video mode, so just please watch that out as well. But otherwise, this camera, if you don't care a lot about the dynamic range, if you don't care a lot about the moire and aliasing, and if you just want to get that kind of the old vintage digital vibe, yet still has very nice full manual control and also very nice colors in total out of this camera, and you just want to have that old digital vibe feel to your images, then this camera is a great camera. And as I'm already hinting into the conclusion, let me just conclude this video. Overall, I would still recommend this camera. It is under €80, so it is no brainer. Of course, if you want to spend a little bit more, still under €100, do look at the G12, because it is also a much better camera in terms of the controls and certain other functions that it has. But in the same time, in many ways, it is still a same camera as this, because it has the same resolution. It only has a few more controls. It only has a few better resolution in videos. It also just has a better construction of the camera overall. But overall, in terms of the image quality, it's pretty much no difference compared to the G11. So for a camera that's under €80, I think it's a worth investment to really spend on and experiment with, because it is still a very powerful camera if you know what you're doing, and also if you have in mind the concept that you want to do with this camera already. It is also a nice experimental camera, as I mentioned and repeated so many times already, but I just couldn't repeat it enough because it has so many versatile features, and it's the camera that's still very small and light to really take it to many places with you. It has shutter speed of 4,000 of a second, so it is still very versatile when you're using that f2.8 on a bright sunny day. Of course, I do wish that this camera camera would be able to go up to 8,000th of a second, but in the same time, I cannot really ask for everything out of, you know, such a small and old camera. So overall, I feel like this camera is a nice camera if you just either want to get experimental with, or just want a nice compact camera that gives you that old vintage digital look, or just a nice camera that, you know, it is cheap and it is still really delivering that really good image quality without spending a lot of money, but also giving you that manual control and also allow you to actually go out and freshen up your mind a little bit. Because for me, this camera really helps me to freshen up my mind, especially, you know, having such a stripped down camera. Of course, I'm not talking about, you know, all the scene modes and all the other fully automated modes, because I don't use them. I generally use manual modes and aperture priority, and for that, this camera does give me, just like with the G10, G1X, G12, and so on and so forth, this camera really gives me a really completely new perspective, freshen up my mind a little bit using this camera because of the limitations that it has. Just using what this lens has to offer, using what this camera, the sensor has to offer, and also the modes and everything. It's just a very nice camera to use that actually still allows me to also still be connected with the environment around me. So yeah, the build quality is great. I've taken it through rain, through dust storms, and also just, you know, through heat waves, and also the opposite weather temperature as well. So yeah, overall, I would still recommend this camera if you're, you know, into any of those categories that I just mentioned. If this camera is not really for you, and if that's what you think it really is, then yeah, then it's not really for you. But just keep in mind, this camera is still a very nice experimental camera to experiment with, or even just to have it with you for fun. So yeah, there's that. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free on my website. Feel free to just click the link down in the description section below. It's absolutely for free. Don't need to commit to anything. Don't need to submit your email address, nothing. Just click and download, and I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense. And if you have any questions, any stories to share, any experience to share, anything that I might have missed out, feel free to also just comment down in the comment section down below as well. Again, this has been a video that's pretty much based on my thoughts on how I use this camera. So if there are features that I didn't cover, it's just simply because I didn't use it, and I just feel like it's not really important sharing something that I don't use, because why share something that I don't use to you guys, because I really have no experience in it. So yeah, I only share with the features that I really use, and for those features, I find that this camera pretty much a great camera, and pretty much all of the honest opinions has been laid out already in the video. So I hope you actually find it helpful. And yeah, otherwise, I thank you all very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.